This is scary. What if the Tower of Babel wasn't just a biblical story? What if it was more? If you didn't know, the Tower of Babel is rumored to be a massive tower that was built by the ancient Babylonians. It's said that they tried to build it to reach the heavens. But could there be any truth to this tale? The Tower of Babel story can be found in the book of Genesis, which is in the Bible. According to the Bible, the people who lived in Babylon began to build the tower to reach the heavens, but God was disappointed with their efforts. God then decided to make everyone speak different languages, which in turn made it impossible to finish the construction of the tower. So the tower was then abandoned and in turn never finished. This biblical account is seen to be a myth or allegory today, but some researchers do believe that the Tower of Babel is an actually real structure. The ancient city of Babylon in the modern day is located in Iraq and was home to some of the greatest architecture and engineering of all time. Babylon is known for its ziggurats, which are massive stepped pyramids that were religious temples.
There are so many problems with this Tower of Babel story that the Bible gets wrong. Let's just start with the Bible. So part one, the Bible is incorrect. The Bible is incorrect because when you look at the story of the Tower of Babel begins in and around 2300 BCE. So we have around 2300 BCE, after the flood of Noah, that the Bible story talks about the building of this Tower of Babel, and that the entire world at this time frame spoke the exact same language. But when you look at Genesis 10, one thing that you may or may not have ever noticed is that after it talks about the children of Shem, Japheth, and Ham, that each one of their children went away and had their own language. Go back and read it, Genesis 10. It says that each one was of their own nation and had their own language. So this would indicate that after the flood, around 2300, that each one of these people spoke a different language already. So there was not one language that was spoken all over the world during this time frame in around 2300 BCE. Now, the second problem is that the Babylonian Empire did not begin until Hammurabi came along in the 18th century, which will be in around 1700s. That is when the Babylonian Empire was created, and the worship center moved from Nippur to Babylonia, and they established the city of Babylon, which in the Babylonian language, Babylon means gateway of the gods. So Babel means gateway, Lonia, gate of the gods. So this is what Babylonia actually meant to the Babylonian people, the Amorites, who were a Semitic people. Now, this means that it is an impossibility for the children of Noah to have been the ones that built the Tower of Babel, since they were not part of the Babylonian Empire, did not establish the Babylonian Empire, and they all spoke a different language already. Later on, where most people start to think about this story and where the Israelite most likely got this story from, is from the fact that Hammurabi, during his time frame, did build a tower, a ziggurat, that was to be one of the tallest buildings ever built. But the building was never completed. When we get to Nebuchadnezzar in the 600 BCE, so almost a millennium later, we get Nebuchadnezzar, who attempts to rebuild an unfinished ziggurat. And so when the Israelite children were released in 539, 525 time frame out of Babylonian captivity from the Persians, they took this story of the unfinished Babylonian tower and concocted a version of the story that meant all the languages has been changed, because in the Israelite language, the Hebrew language, there is a similar word, Babel, which means confusion. So they took the Semitic word of the Amorites, meaning gateway, to change it to mean confusion, and created a story that described people not being able to communicate as to why the tower was not finished 1,000+ years prior, and Nebuchadnezzar still not being able to finish this tower himself, to mean that God confused the languages of men in order to stop man from their pride work of trying to reach the gods. Now, there is a Akkadian Sumerian story that talks about a Tower of Babel that was created as a communication tower for Marduk and his armies as they fought against Enlil, and that Enlil destroyed the tower and therefore caused confusion with the armies of Marduk, who then couldn't communicate. And if you understand military tactics, one of the first things that you want to disrupt is your enemy's ability to communicate with each other, because now they cannot have coordinated attacks or defenses. And the next thing you do is mess up their supply lines. So most likely, this was a wartime story by the Sumerians and Akkadians that then became a story of just not being able to complete a tower at Ziggurat by Hammurabi for whatever reason. And then Nebuchadnezzar, for whatever his reason, still was not able to finish off this tower. And the Israelite people deemed it as something that their God had done through confusing languages. Now, there is the other question. If this God goal was to, every time man builds something, that he would confuse the language so that they couldn't complete building something, logic should tell you that this is a very improbable story. How many towers do we have in the world today that are much higher than what the Tower of Babel was being built? We have a space station up there. We have the International Space Station. People of multiple language came together and built the International Space Station. We had Mir before the International Space Station. And this was a Soviet-built space station that started to be shared by many nations of different languages. You can go to a construction site today, and there are people who are constructing it, and like here in the United States, the primary builders may speak English, but many of their workers do not speak English. So therefore, how are they able to build this tower? So this guy had a problem with the Babylonian tower, but yet it does not have a problem with the Empire State Building, does not have a problem with the Bank of America building in downtown Atlanta, doesn't have a problem with any other skyscraper, doesn't have a problem with space stations, but yet had a problem with this Babylonian tower. I think logic and history would indicate that the Israelites borrowed this story from the Babylonians in their inability to complete this one ziggurat, and that would be a big eyesore and a big failure on the government's part, and concocted their own version of why this tower was never completed and made it into their propaganda so that they can perpetuate their religion. But the writers must have forgotten that in the Noah story, his 3 sons, their children, established and spoke different languages before the Babylonian Empire was ever created and ever established by Hammurabi. So that in itself would say that your Bible is grossly incorrect and contradicts itself in its writings about all men speaking the same language and this guy confusing their language. Think about it. And as you think about it, you will realize how illogical and how historically inaccurate this story is. So always remember, you have to free yourself to be yourself, because your greatness is non-negotiable. Good journey, good vibrations. And I wonder how they use Joe Rogan's voice. Must be AI.